time on the show by Tim McMillan, retired police officer, investigator, investigative journalist. Tim, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, no, thanks. It's great to talk to you again, Jazz.
Yeah, it's been a while. Last time we talked, we normally, when you and I are chatting, it tends to veer off into stuff about government secrecy and UFOs and fun things. Today, we got a bit more of a serious subject that I wanted to address, and you've been involved in this personally recently on a number of fronts. And we're here to talk about police abuse of power and some of the cases we've seen, deaths of suspects in captivity, two in particular that I wanted to address. But I wanted to start, and I'll remind everybody, we'll put a link to Tim's first interview with us in the show notes, and just remind you that when we went through that, he described pretty much his entire law enforcement history, which is impressive. So if you missed that, go back and check it out. I want to start today with what's going on in Minneapolis because, excuse me, and no, that's not COVID. You've had some direct involvement with that. I've seen you posting about that on social media. There was a recent statement that was put out by a group you're associated with, which we'll get to towards the end of the interview. But we all know what went on with the person who was killed in custody, had his neck knelt on, George Floyd, of course we're talking about. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that you were involved with Minneapolis police in some fashion, or you had some experience with them. And I'm not going to put any words in your mouth. Can you tell us how you came to have interactions with the Minneapolis police, and just to start with some of your general thoughts, concerns that you may have had, if you had any?
Sure. Yeah, Jazz. Yeah, this has all been very disheartening for me because you're right. I was pretty familiar with Minneapolis Police Department. The last few years of my law enforcement career I wore a lot of hats, but one of the things, the roles that I took on a national level related to community policing and police reform. Probably a little different than people are accustomed to when they see it on the news and everything, because people yell police reform and it's about coming up with best ways to both benefit the community and law enforcement equally, because fundamentally the people are the police and the police are the people. Excuse me. I mean, we're all people, and so it was how we can come to be more effective at policing and gain community trust. And so a lot of my last couple of my years involved going around giving lectures to different groups, meeting with different groups. Also, I was a national certified instructor in implicit bias, which is unconscious prejudices that we all have. In relation to law enforcement, how those unconscious biases dictate how we're policing communities. And I was involved in some of the 21st century police initiative programs and stuff, looking at different agencies across the country and how they were performing. And a lot of it involved listening to the public which wasn't being done. So going around and hearing what people had to say and being both a law enforcement officer, but an outsider. I wasn't part of that agency, but yet understood all the idiosyncrasies of law enforcement. It was highly effective to be able to do that. Unfortunately, the programs kind of went away, but Minneapolis Police Department was one of it was number one on the list of agencies that I had spoken to people from the community, from in the not the officers themselves, but in the criminal justice system there. So prosecutors, defense attorneys, all of this, the legal system there. And by far, the stories that I was hearing, Minneapolis was number one on the list that I said.
Number one in terms of concerns?
Yes. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Number one in terms of the concerns I was hearing, the problematic behavior, and something that was kind of far more widespread than the old just a few bad apples type thing. And again, I caveat that by saying I only got one side of it because the program was kind of canceled and ran out before real work got to be done, where you bring these, here's what the public really thinks about you to the law enforcement agencies to see what they have to say. But it did give it gave you a picture of how the community viewed their law enforcement there, and it was extremely negative and disturbing. Some of the stories that I was told, frankly, um, I was shocked. I would use those stories in later classes because you go to agencies, and the thing is that it's almost like you're in a little fiefdom. The agency I worked for, we had a great relationship with the community. And I didn't work in Mayberry. Our violent crime rate was about 300 or 400% higher than Chicago. To give you an idea, we dealt with serious stuff, but we had a great community involvement. Um, and so it was explaining to officers some of the stuff you see on TV and the news may not be your agency. However, it doesn't mean those concerns aren't there. And I mean, stories of, you know, I was told by somebody that they had witnessed a Minneapolis officer placing a mentally handicapped child in the trunk of their police car one time to control them.
Whoa.
Yeah, I mean, and the people who I spoke with, some of these were actually probably some of the most disturbing were because they were in confidence, but they were disturbed by what they were hearing were spouses of some of the officers who not came forward, vetted who they were, but like, look, this is the stuff my husband says they do, and all this, and this is a problem. Down to the fact that I remember talking to some of the legal professionals, some of the lawyers in that area, that they had a huge number of what's called Brady Cops. And what that means is under Brady case law, if you're ever impeached as an officer, meaning you're found to be a liar, proven liar, you're what's called a Brady Cop. You can't testify on the stand anymore for obvious reasons. You're incredible.
Never heard of
Now, yes, yep, it goes under case law. So Brady is the case law, the Supreme Court case that rules that. Now, under most normal circumstances, if an officer becomes what's called a Brady Cop, that's the end of their career. I mean, if you're a proven liar, you can't testify on the stand. You can't arrest somebody. However, they have a very powerful union there, very, very powerful union, that they had a high propensity of Brady Cops, meaning they had officers on the job collecting a paycheck, but in effect couldn't make arrests, couldn't go to court. They were just collected a paycheck to an extent, but yet carrying a gun and still out there on the streets like any other police officer.
How do you, pardon my asking, because I've never been a police officer, but how do you get sent out on patrol if you're not authorized to arrest anyone? Are you just monitoring or going for a stroll? Or
you're basically a report taker. So there's, I mean, arresting people is a very small part of what a law enforcement officer's day-to-day job is. Monthly, yearly, that's a very small percentage. And so all the other problem-solving activities, whether it's just taking general police reports or you name it. But in those instances, if it's a serious type of event that could result in going to court, so it's a burglary, I got to take a burglary report for, this gets handed off to another officer. And so these would be instances where if they're on the street in those capacities, oftentimes in these situations, it's very rare. It's very, very rare. But if you hear agencies who retain these people, you ever heard the term rubber gun squads, stuff like that, where they're assigned to some, especially large department, they're assigned to some office of, the janitor's closet, and, they're not out there and about. But in this, and in one particular case, I remember talking to a attorney there who told me one of the officers who was working there had arrested someone, beat them up in the back of their police car, taken their cell phone and destroyed it, threw it away, and then took them to jail. And this officer was actually charged and convicted for this, and I think ended up doing less than a year in jail, but under union terms and everything, this officer came back to work. And so they were stunned because under the law that they were charged under, and I worked in the state of Georgia, so I don't know all the state law in Minnesota, but evidently, and it may have been kidnapping, because they're in custody. They take somebody away and kidnapping.
Okay.
It was a sex crime, and so this was a registered sex offender and somebody who'd already abused authority, and they told me they had been let back into the department. Mind-boggling.
Can I
And
steer you back to
mm-hmm,
something you said earlier?
mm-hmm,
You mentioned what you referred to as the bad apple theory, and I will tell you right up front, I am one of those people who have gone through my entire life being a proponent, a champion of the bad apple theory. We've
mm-hmm.
had in my family, most of the men served in the military. A lot of them went on to be police officers because that's sometimes a natural progression. And all fine, honorable people. And my experience with cops, and I admit I had the experience of a white person growing up in the Northeast, which is very different than the experience of people, minorities in the cities. I was out in a rural area, you know. But yeah, I've always felt the vast majority of police are just good, honest people who go into that line of work in order to help people. And every once in a while, because they're human beings, you get a few that slip through the cracks that turn out to be really bad, but you don't know until they do something. Let, can I ask you to put your knowledge and what you've discovered about the Minneapolis PD in terms of the bad apple theory? Do you sometimes get a police department where it's not one or two or eight bad apples, but the entire barrel's gone bad,
Sure.
or
Yeah.
mostly?
No, that's a great point to bring up because you're right. And the bad apple theory, it absolutely makes sense. And at its core, I wholeheartedly believe that it is true. And what I mean by that is when you describe a bad apple as someone who is willing to do criminal behavior, enjoys bullying people or hurting people, overtly is a criminal but has a badge. I do believe that that is indeed, and that's my experience in both being in law enforcement for almost 20 years and just in going around the country talking to different officers, talking to the public. So the true bad apple is that narrow scope in the group. However, what you see and what I was just describing, the problems at Minneapolis Police Department or the problems in other agencies, and the real significant issue, and I think obviously I don't, where change, true positive change needs to come is oftentimes the biggest issue is not one bad apple. It's a systemic kind of cultural climate that's instilled in different agencies. And it's the behavior that's allowed to be tolerated, or it's the behavior that is made to seem okay. And you have young officer, comes to the academy and everything. They come out here, they learn from the older officers, and this is the system that's in place there. And one of the, here's a great example. Uh, the idea of going to the American police force is going to war on anything, whether it's drugs, crime, violent crime. Like, it makes great headlines and it's good political, uh, good selling point. However, if you put it in context there, what you're asking officers to do, they should never be going to war with anyone, because this is the American public. These are citizens. And so when you instill this war mentality, people often ask me about the militarization of police. And I say it's not the equipment, it's the mindset. When you believe you're going to war in the community, and you're not going into the community of people like yourself, human beings, members of the community that you're here to help.
The
And
enemy.
right, when you view them as the enemy, there's a problem there. And at some agencies, that's absolutely the us against them kind of mentality. It's nothing that's taught in a class. It's very much the climate and environment that the entire tone of the agency and field. And that's what allows bad behavior to come up. And more importantly, that's where you have events like you saw at Ferguson, Baltimore, recently in Minneapolis. These, George Floyd's death is tragic, and it should have never happened. Um, However, the people aren't mad. They're not out there protesting. It didn't become such a significant deal just because of George Floyd. It was a tipping point. These events lead up. This is just a cultural where the community's had enough. because these are the kind of things that they have grown accustomed to. And then when something so egregious is shown, you've got a video of it, that's a tipping point. And that's what we would find. That's what we found, whether it was in Ferguson, whether it was in Baltimore, is that all the problems leading up to these could have been stemmed off early on. And quite frankly, it's nice to be retired now, and I can say, more often than not, those problems aren't ever solved, even when they come to this big national level. And that is because often overlooked, and these officers were charged. Be interested to see the outcome of those. I do believe they should have been charged. However, the idea that that solved the problem with just them, if all 4 officers go to prison, that solved the problem. That's probably not the case, because the fish stinks from the head down, and that means
speaking of the head of the fish, I did want to touch on this. In 2017, Minneapolis had their first African American police chief appointed. I'm going to butcher his name. It's Arredondo, something to that effect. I apologize to him or any of his family listening. And one of the reasons that was cited, I was going back in preparation for this interview and looking at some of the old articles, was that there was already an awareness that there was a problem. There was an awareness that there was a problem with, how different races were treated, a variety of things. And the new chief was brought in, I don't think just as a symbolic figure, like, look, we've appointed a black police chief, but someone who would understand those issues and try to bring in change. Is that a way to at least address systemic problems like this? Do you think it was at least somewhat effective for Minneapolis, or was that just sort of, nothing really changed?
Well, I don't know, because just speaking specifically for that agency, and that's, again, I want to caveat everything I've said about that specific department. I'm really basing my information on the 2016, just before that chief was hired, 2017 timeframe. And so, since leaving law enforcement, I walked away from there. So I don't know what state they were in prior to that. I'm not sure what he initiated. Can a chief inspire change and change the culture of an agency? Absolutely. It takes a strong leader, because in often cases when we're talking about this, it means coming in and starting to just wipe out command staff and get rid of street sergeants up to deputy chiefs when you have problem people, and
dealing with their union.
That's one thing I everywhere I went around that I would tell people. The state of Georgia, where I worked, it is illegal for the police to unionize. So we never, even as both the officer level or when I made it into executive staff and the command level, I never had to deal with the problems of the police union, where their purpose can be good, but yet oftentimes when I would go out there and hear kind of the horror stories, you realize that the union really obstructed, in certain cases, the ability to weed out the bad apples or bring about change that would be positive. It's this, instead of being set up to protect the officers' rights and make sure that they're taken care of, it was more of a at times just we're going to be your adversarial advocate, and no matter how bad you are. That's one I can tell you with Minneapolis. That was overwhelmingly across the board, from both the public to, like I said, people that were working in the legal profession there, is that their police union in Minneapolis is very, very powerful and very, very influential. And I believe, in fact, I believe at least back then, the president of the police union in Minneapolis, ironically, the gentleman's last name is Cruel. And I believe that, so it would have been not the current chief, but the previous one he was forbidden from wearing his uniform while conducting union business, because he was just so, it was just such a bad representation.
Not for nothing, but the new police chief in Philadelphia's last name is Outlaw. So take that for what you will. Daniel Outlaw, wow. Yes.
That's actually cool. Hey, you got to become a police chief. Your last name Outlaw.
You got no other choice. I don't, yeah, I want to push on a little bit, and that was all
Hmm.
really good. You mentioned Georgia several times. That was on my list. You served when you were full time working as a police officer in Garden City, Georgia,
Yes.
and is that correct? And I believe
Yes.
that's a ways to the north of the next place I wanted to ask you about, which is Glynn County, Georgia, and the
Hmm.
Glynn County Police. That is where a young man by the last name of Arbery was killed earlier this year. And it was another case where a video came to light, although much longer period of time in between the actual incident and when the video came out. And he wasn't killed by active duty police officers. He was killed by, well, he was pursued by a father and son. The father was definitely a former police officer. The son had worked as an investigator somewhere in law enforcement, also in some office related to that. And so it's not an exact parallel, but it was another case where people were really horrified when they saw the video. And now it's sort of blown up, and the two men have been arrested. I I'll share with you without being able to reveal their name. Someone who's like a neighbor in that county reached out to us shortly after this whole thing started. I've done several interviews, and even before I talked to you, this person had me wondering about the whole bad apple, bad barrel of apples theory, because they had stories of a, just the opening of the first letter I got was, "You saw the video. You have no idea. There have been people dying down here for years. These cops kill people on a regular basis, and nobody ever hears about it." And it was just this unleashing, and then I started digging, and the records of some of the incidents, not just with those two in question, a lot of the cops, people in the district attorney's office, some of the judges have all been removed or, you know, chastised officially, and all this stuff that's going on. So I'll start by asking, that's a little ways from where you were, but did you have ever any interaction with the Glynn County law enforcement system? Did you know people up there? Do you have any personal insight to that?
You know, I certainly, assuredly, I would have known some officers in Glynn County, though I can't think of any off the top of my head, just because, uh, at least a portion of my career, I was a canine handler, and we often traveled, did all sorts of things with the dogs for that purpose. And Glynn County, you're right, is about 45 minutes away from Savannah. Uh, but it is in that kind of corridor there where nothing you just said surprises me. And in fact, I can remember when I got out of law enforcement for a year, before I just started doing freelance journalism, I was working for a law firm as an investigator and an intel analyst, handling a lot of civil rights cases and stuff. And I was frequently in that corridor because that's closer to, it's kind of in between Savannah and Jacksonville area. But that little corridor, and if you head it towards the west as you get out there, the part of Georgia where kind of you say is no man's land because if you say you're from Georgia, it's like either the coast or Atlanta. Nobody even knows about that little chunk.
Right.
I I remember seeing and hearing things then, especially on the kind of you could arguably say the other side of the law on the defense attorney side. Um, I remember being blown away. And you're exactly right, where it was not just law enforcement, it was judges, it was sheriffs, it was, you know, corruption at its finest in different things. And so none of that surprises me, what you're saying there. In terms of any officer involved shooting deaths, anything during my career, I'm trying to think if I would have heard from. I don't recall any that were really harrowing or anything. I don't recall anything like that. But it is a little bit of the wild, wild west, you could say. They're chasing people and all
I
sorts of.
documented a few of them at our site, and I'll go back and
Hmm.
dig them up and send you the links.
Yeah.
There was one where I just compiled a bunch, but they had one police officer who had, I guess, excusably shot multiple people over the course of his career, and there were tons of complaints until finally he wound up killing this one woman who was mentally ill inside of her car and just put like 9 slugs into her. She was unarmed. And then after that, he got off again and wasn't nothing happened to him, and he wound up killing his ex-wife and her new boyfriend before finally taking his own life in a standoff with his fellow police. But again, you mentioned officer-involved killings. They certainly seem to have more than their fair share for such a low population, more suburban, in some cases, rural area. So that's certainly alarming. But when we look at the Arbery case, I wanted to ask you about, is there a stereotype? And this might be an offensive question. I apologize in advance if it is. But over the course of my life, it's always felt like there was a stereotype that Southern law enforcement was worse than Northern law enforcement. Maybe it goes back to Smokey and the Bandit and the whole boss hog thing. But then there are real life stories. I'm old enough to remember there was a time, I think it was in the 70s, where like the entire New Orleans police force was basically fired because they were so incredibly corrupt. Do you get the impression now that we're talking about Minneapolis that that's just a television thing, that it's not just Southern cops, that every department can have those same problems if things get out of control?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And what a great question to bring up, and I'm glad to share that, because it's the exact opposite. We found the exact opposite, and you're right. For very obvious reasons, the South has more stereotypically is considered as being more racist and having more problems. Law enforcement is viewed as being the authoritarian and more of a oppression towards minorities and everything. Again, for good reason, I think. I mean, you can look all the way in the 60s with Alabama, Birmingham, and obviously going all the way back to the Confederacy. There's good reason why that stereotype exists. However, when we would go out and talk to people, and this is also people at agencies now, it was the total opposite, to the point where I can remember being stunned at seeing or hearing about overt racism. So this is people using racial epithets and I mean overt racism. These were all from northern areas, and we actually really examined like what the heck's going on here. And the reason behind that, and this is where we had less of that in the South, is because if you look at the South, you pull up a racial dot matrix map. You can Google it. They've got some really good ones online. It'll give you the color-coded from the last census of where people of different races who reported live with each other. And so when you look at the areas, Minneapolis, St. Louis was one during the time because we were right around the Ferguson events. When you pull that up, you see expressly de facto segregation. So, with St. Louis, it was everybody who was non-white lived on this half. Everybody who was white lived here. I mean, it was just cut down the middle.
The other side of the tracks.
The other side of the tracks. Same thing. If you look at Minneapolis's dot tracks, you're going to see it's a predominantly white city, but you have this clump of that's just in the inner city that's predominantly, or almost not just predominantly, exclusively minority. I mean, these are neighborhoods that don't see anybody or interact with anybody of a different race. In fact, you brought up New Orleans. One of my closest friends, who's still in law enforcement now. In fact, my middle son is named after him. That's how close we are. Gideon. We started the agency together. He was a black male from New Orleans who admittedly told me he had never had a conversation with a white person until he joined the Army. Not because he was racist, but because where he grew up, there wasn't. That's where it was. It was that segregated. De facto. Nobody's forcing anybody. Whereas now, if you were to pull up the matrix map of Savannah, where I was, or Charleston was a good example we used, because if you recall, in Charleston, they had arguably one of the most horrific police shootings videotaped in modern history, where the officer shot and killed the man, shot him in the back as he was running away.
You're talking about Michael Slager?
Yes, yep. And that officer was convicted. But you'll recall you didn't have the same community response in terms of even the racial overtones. And so when you pull up the maps of Charleston or Savannah or a lot of these areas, you will notice that unlike St. Louis and Minneapolis, the color-coded racial dot matrix map is it's like a rainbow. And what you're seeing there is what's called contact theory. In fact, we taught implicit bias classes and how you overcome the implicit biases we all have. We can't help it because it's kind of put into the TV shows we watch, all these types of things. But how you overcome that is through contact theory, meaning the more people, more diverse individuals that you come in contact with and get to know as individuals, the least likely you are to view people by total groups and have prejudices, have biases. And so for us, I can remember when we first, because we would go around and I was with two other instructors. One of them was Noble Ware, who would end up being the director of the 21st Century Police Community Initiative for the last presidential administration. And I remember us going to classes near Atlanta, and he was from Wisconsin. There was another instructor there from California, and she was teaching. She mentioned something about, what would you do if you saw a black man, very similar to Glynn County, black man jogging in an all-white neighborhood. For the area we were there in, there was just blank stares from the cops, because the idea of like an all-white neighborhood, sure, they do exist in the South, but it was not nearly as this is not something, especially for us, we're a bunch of working class cops that we're like, what's that? There's this exclusive neighborhoods that are just de facto all one ethnicity, one religion, one race. They just didn't exist. When I went to high school, my high school was a great 50-50 mix of everything. You played football with people of all different races. You just grew up around people with different backgrounds. So contact theory in the South is actually more prevalent. Now, the caveat to that is, like you just mentioned, we're talking about Glynn County, and as you get further away from the more metropolitan areas, such as Savannah, Macon, Augusta, Atlanta, obviously when you get to the rural areas, you're going to now see the exact opposite, where it tends to be very much like you see in the larger cities up north. So they're going to be predominantly one race, inside pockets are very tightly clumped. And so now you don't have that good contact theory again. And this is just a breeding point of how you have issues. And so that's a very long way of saying what you're describing in Glynn County and some of those rural areas down there in Georgia. Absolutely, I can see why those problems exist. They exist for the same reasons that they exist in somewhere like Minneapolis or St. Louis. It's just not as apparent. And so where in the big cities up there, you've got that same kind of divide, where people only know people of one race and grow up that way. And that is widely problematic. Going back to what we said about the bad apple theory. I used to teach this. The most dangerous cop, the most dangerous prejudiced cop is not the overt racist. Because frankly, in my career, in terms of working with me, I never worked with anybody or heard anybody say any kind, no using any kind of racial epithets, anything like that. And I can't recall ever hearing that or seeing that kind of junk going on, period. However, the most dangerous instances are when you have, say you have a young man who's grown up, or a young man or woman who's grown up in an all-white neighborhood somewhere. They become the police, and now you're sent to different areas that you didn't grow up in, different areas here. Or if you're in somewhere like Minneapolis, your beat is a neighborhood that's all minority. Well, now this becomes your contact theory. And so where you didn't have the good experiences of realizing people are people, doesn't matter, there's good and bad people of all races and backgrounds, suddenly your experience with minorities becomes that 8 or 12-hour shift that you work in that area you work. And it may shock you, Jazz, but people very rarely call the police to be like, hey, just want to let you know things are going great right now.
I understand. You don't get many calls like that. No, you get called when something's going wrong.
And that becomes their view of people of color a lot of times. Or, vice versa, either way. So, any class that they have, that becomes their only experience with. And then that whether they realize it or not. And that's why the implicit bias classes were so important. And because that's the unconscious bias. We don't realize it, but it influences us. The media we see, the TV we watch, the movies, the music, whether we realize it or not, if it portrays people, places, or events in a certain way, it has an influence on us. And so for those officers, it would negatively influence it. If anybody wants to really see it in action, go back and read, I believe it was the New Yorker, but when Darren Wilson, who was the man who shot and killed Michael Brown and started the Ferguson Police Department.
Right.
You can go back and read his first interview, and the first time he came out publicly and gave an interview to them. Go back and read that, and I bet you most people would be shocked, because I remember I read it and went, you could see the trouble brewing in terms of, he described why he came to work at Ferguson. He had worked at another department, but Ferguson was where all the action was, and he wanted to go where the action was. And so suddenly you're not policing people. It's kind of like a roller coaster ride. You're there for the fun. But more shockingly, you would assume in his case, he would be the last person who would want anybody in the world, given everything that happened, to view him as racist. I mean, you would think that's kind of a given. Like, you wouldn't want the... But in that interview, you'll see him talk about his first training officer, who happened to be a gay man. But he was talking about how good he could interact with the community and everything, because he would talk to him about being gay, that he could understand from people who, in minority or disenfranchised groups, he could kind of relate to it. And he's in that article, and he says, he was just great with getting along to people. In fact, if you picked up the phone and were talking to him, you might think you were talking to a black guy. And I remember reading it going, what do you mean by that, Darren? Like, black people talking to all sorts, are you talking to Denzel Washington? Are you talking to Lil Wayne the rapper? Like it was.
Yeah, I don't have a guess for that.
Yeah, right.
I'll have to go back and read that again. Look, there's one more important thing I want to touch on. I'm not trying to cut you off, but I know we can't keep this going all day. You recently published a link, and I immediately went and checked it out, which is one of the things that spurred me to ask you to come back and speak with us. There's a group, make sure I get the name right, Law Enforcement Action Partnership, and recently published, and you signed on to this, a document titled basically National Policing Recommendations, which sounds like a very generic, thing, but it covers much of what's going on with the George Floyd situation, but in more general terms, like every law enforcement activity in the country should probably look at their practices. And here's our suggestions. I will link to that in the show notes. I'd like people to go. It's not terribly long. The longest part is all the signatures, but Tim did sign it. Could you just give us the quick, bullet point stuff that you covered in terms of where these problems come from and positive steps that could be taken to maybe cut down on these problems in the future?
Sure. Yeah. No, I'll be happy to do that. And and you're right. This is not just for Minneapolis Police Department. This is not just in reference to the George Floyd death. This is something that we recommend law enforcement be adopted nationwide. And because ultimately it's only to benefit both the public and police. And I think, I urge anybody to check it out, because you'll see that assuredly there's lots of recommendations that have been made out there, oftentimes many of them not from people with law enforcement backgrounds or anything. And so they tend to be extreme and dramatic. But you'll see that nothing, as you read it, you go, wow, this is all common sense. Why isn't this already in place in certain degrees? And you're exactly right. Some of these things should be. And some of the things, it is split up in terms of what recommendations to the legislative branches, so to Congress, to the executive branch, to the president, and to state and local governments, because ultimately that's the most significant. State and local governments are really who rule the roost in departments because of how states' rights and all that stuff. Whole other conversation. But one of the first things was, in terms of congressional things, is people would be shocked at the lack of data and transparency that's even required in law enforcement. And that's one of the things that if you've ever heard people have an argument over whether it's a racial demographic or whoever, who the police shoot and kill more, right? And you can see all these figures and everything. I'll just go ahead and say, you can, if you want to avoid that debate and everything, you can politely excuse yourself by saying, well, interestingly enough, there's absolutely no law in place that says that any law enforcement agency has to report how many people they shoot. And so therefore, we don't know. There's no data tracking. And in fact, those numbers that you often see were put together by a gentleman, a friend of mine, Wesley Lowery, with the Washington Post, who runs the police fatal police shooting database. Prior to that, there's no requirement for law enforcement to even notify anybody. I mean, obviously you're going to hear about it, but in terms of getting a broad picture of data on there, there's not there. It seems silly to me. I mean, how can we, so that's one of the first things is identifying how significant of a problem it is, or even having a debate over what it is or isn't. We actually need to be able to gather the data. And so part of that is saying that is something that should be legislated if agencies aren't going to do that. And that includes as well, there's no nationalized or standard in terms of when a law enforcement officer is fired for corruption, all sorts of things. Maybe they've committed a crime, they just get fired. There's no standard across the board that says that, depending on each state, that agency has to report that to anybody or even put that in a personnel file. I mean, we hear about this quite often where one officer gets fired from an agency for something who they probably should never have a gun and badge again, but yet, they go 2 towns over and there they are. and that, and then when they do something wrong, agency 2 is saying, well, agency 1 never told us. And sometimes that's not true, but still, that's kind of standardizing and saying that in Georgia, that was whenever you had to report whenever a law enforcement officer left. Was it voluntary resignation? Was it resignation in lieu of termination, or were they terminated? And if they were terminated, their certification was examined. But that's just Georgia. That standard's not across the board. And so that was one of the claims there is discipline hearings and officers leaving. It can all be summed up to better hiring practices. Let's make sure we're getting the right qualified people that we want in there. The other things in terms of, I think, I'm big on, because that's what I do now, a lot of public transparency stuff in government. It's funny to come from government and now be, haggling government for transparency, yet at the same time, I say I still do the same thing I've always been doing, which is upholding the U.S. Constitution. And so
everyone in the government, in my experience, wants transparency for other people's departments and groups.
Right, exactly.
You know it from personal experience how transparent the Pentagon is about certain things, but they always talk about other aspects of the government. This needs to be very transparent. Oh, we'd like to ask you a question. Kind of busy.
Yep. Yes. No. And that was, part of it relates to making sure that, and to some degree, you're right, it can be a pain in the federal government because it can take a long time with FOIA requests, the Freedom of Information Act, but it's there. There's a process to go with it. You can request records. They can deny them, but they have to tell you why. You can appeal that. There's a system in place. To a certain extent, that doesn't, each state has their own little sunshine laws, as they call them, or FOIA laws. But with agencies.
But again, going back to your point, and I apologize for interrupting, you can request all the livelong day. But if there's no requirement for people to keep records, there may be no records to turn over to you, and they may have no interest in discussing it.
Yes, and that's why, that's one of the bullet points is transparency and making sure that what records are being kept, how those records can be accessed, all of that is clear to the public, because at the end of the day, law enforcement, much like any other institution in government, are public servants. When I was a cop, I served the public. I mean, that's who paid my salary. The whole, I pay your salary, bud. Well, you're kind of right. It is a tax revenue service. And so, if people have the ability to clearly see how they can access information, how they can find out, hey, your officer's being investigated for this, or I want to be able to report a complaint and file a complaint against an officer. Is that going to be investigated? All these clear process steps and policies. We believe it should be transparent. People should have control over that, and they should know. It's about regaining public trust. And then, because that's a big one. And I'll tell you, I didn't realize it until I went out and talked to other people, because I was very, very, very fortunate, Jazz. I worked for my chief of police, who hired me, a man named David Lyons. He's now the U.S. Marshal for the Southern District, right there in Savannah. And he's former, he's an Army colonel, retired Army colonel, became a chief of police. Phenomenal man. Because all of these things that are in these recommendations, and a lot of what I'm telling you, that was how I was raised. From 21 years old, when I strapped on a badge, that is all of these things that seem normal to me, like a standard set of practices. How we were promoted there was black and white. You knew everybody had an equal shot at promotions and testing. If you wanted to make a complaint on one of our officers, there was nobody. You knew you could come in, get the form, get it signed. It would be assigned to a lieutenant. It would be investigated. You would receive a follow-up. I mean, like, these things were all standard to me. It wasn't until I went out and about did I go, holy cow, not everybody does this. And so a lot of that, especially on the local and state level, that is in these recommendations, is saying, being transparent about how someone can complain about something. Do they get a response, once they file a complaint? And do they have an appeal if they don't agree with it? Where can they go to? Is it an outside agency? All of these things are significant. Examining as well the use of force continuum that's in there.
Before you get into that point, and I apologize for this, I stretched this out way too long, and we're nearly out of time. We're not going to be able to hit every bullet point, but I will be linking to it. Use of force is one of the biggest examples that caught my eye, and I'm sure our readers are going to have a debate about this. But in more general terms, whether it's use of force, whether it's how many statistics get reported, but, well, maybe the administrative stuff, there's a clearer case to say this should be standardized. When a chokehold is acceptable, that's mentioned in your document, things like that. Is it your opinion, and do you feel the opinion of the other people who signed this document, people in the law enforcement community, is that something that should be left up to the individual states, or do you think there needs to be a federal government set of guidelines and mandates that every state has to follow? Because that could be constitutionally problematic, and there are those of us who might say to you, one-size-fits-all solutions are not always good because conditions differ in different places. So just please share your thoughts on that briefly. Does it need to be homogenous everywhere?
That's a great one, because there goes the thorny bush in the whole thing and everything, because you're right. It opens up a can of worms constitutionally. It opens up a can of worms personally, debates, rage, all about this. That's a tough one to say. Again, no, I don't think there's one blanket example. Do I believe that a use of force continuum should be outlined by the federal government and set in place? I don't think that's possible under states' rights. However, I do believe that the federal government needs to, and the legislative branch needs to, examine and step in the potential of legislation. And if you read the document, it specifically lists Graham versus Connor in that. This is a Supreme Court ruling that is the standard basis that justifies police use of force today in modern times. It sets the reasonable and prudent standard. So that is how police officers are viewed, whether their force is justified. Prior to that, it was shock the conscience. You could do anything long as you didn't shock the conscience, whatever that means. That was the standard. And so, I'm sure a lot of people, any of your listeners who read that are going to go, because I had some of my fellow officers, not that I work with my agency, but in the area, that reached out. We're like, hey, man, I love everything on here, but this one thing about the use of force thing, I don't know, man. Is this going to get more cops killed because they're being hesitant? No. What this refers to is Graham versus Connor, the reasonable prudent test. This is how police officers judge whether they're justified or unjustified in their use of force, up to deadly force or whatever force. And it states that an officer is justified in using force provided another reasonable and prudent officer would do the same without the benefit of hindsight. It sounds great, but
Okay.
that's impossible. What I'm asking, so what you're asking, what I'm asking, hey Jazz, is the force I just used? Sure, I shot and killed that guy. He was unarmed. But you can't use any of that. You can't know that he was unarmed there, because remember, you've got to try to make a decision of whether that force was justified, not based on everything you know after the fact, but try to put yourself in the officer's shoes. And can you effectively say whether or not that's justified? Because you can't relive the situation. So you've got this a possible standard there. And it also, frankly, relates to how officers can be held accountable for criminal actions. And this will be something that will come up with the George Floyd death trial. It'll be something to watch because the reasonable and prudent standard is going to be brought up. And this is what makes it. People get very, very, very frustrated because they see what appear to be clear-cut cases of abuse of authority or misconduct or fatal officer shootings, and they're like, this is not justified. But you see officers get off, and they're like, how does this keep happening? And you see juries, I mean, the random pull, like well, if you're selected for a jury, Jazz, and you're told, well, this officer is justified in using force. If another police officer a reasonable and prudent officer would do the same without the benefit of knowing what happened in the situation. And that's the standard that you have to determine whether they're guilty or not guilty. Oh, by the way, Jazz, in your case, you've never been a law enforcement officer. So even if you think he's guilty, that's just because you don't know, because you're not a cop. So, you got to side with the reasonable doubt here. So it's an impossible standard when it comes to the criminal court system, because how do you ask 12 people, unless they're all have been police officers, to make a decision of what another reasonable and prudent police officer would do to determine if that's justified? And so it's
I
actually
see what you're saying with the hindsight thing. Like, if you ask the other officer to come up later and say, would you have pulled your gun and fired? But the other officer knows that later on you searched the suspect and they were completely unarmed. Well, then he's probably going to go, well, of course I wouldn't have shot him. But in the moment, you didn't know.
Right. Yeah. It's very difficult standard, but that is the standard in which justice force is judged by. And there's some cases far more disturbing, in my opinion. And gosh, I cannot for the life of me remember his name off the top of my head. But his widow spoke to me on numerous occasions years ago. I believe that he was shot and killed in Phoenix. He was drunk in a hotel room and had a BB gun through his, somebody reported 911 because they saw him looking at a BB gun through the window of his hotel room. He was a traveling construction worker. And police responded, ordered him out of the room. And this was another video that made it out there, where he was laying on the floor prone, and they were telling him to crawl to him and everything. And it's a very, very disturbing video. And the officer has he's got an AR rifle there, and he just shoots him twice and kills him. The guy's just laying on the floor trying to crawl to him. I believe he maybe had his baggy shorts or something, and he tried to pull him up as they're trying, basically telling him to wiggle like a worm to him. And it was very disturbing. It was disturbing. I don't know any other cops that I work with.
I'm not familiar with that one, so
it didn't make the news like a lot of them, but it was probably one of the most disturbing that I'd seen. But that officer got off. That officer was not convicted, and that was for me, that's always been a very emotional one, because they said his widow had been in contact with me up until the point where that officer was found not guilty, and a really super woman. She was saying, she reached out to me because of the stuff I was doing and saying I'm struggling because I want my kids to know police aren't bad guys and everything. This guy killed their father. So I mean, here's this woman who lost her husband to the police, but she's trying to give good examples. But if you do look that up, and I will try to give you a link so that you can look at it, because it's a disturbing case that went under the radar. And if we're going to really examine these instances where, again, that in that document, when you see that, that's what it's talking about. This kind of legal loophole that lets somebody shoot and kill somebody who's on the floor, not armed, not doing anything, and get away with it by saying, well, I was scared. I thought maybe he might have. Because
no, I understand. I get it. I just that's a good example, something for us all to think about. We have overrun our time. We really got to cut this off and go.
Oh, yeah.
As much as I have enjoyed it, I've taken up far too much of your time, and I still have to upload this.
Oh no.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this interview in getting your perspective, because we don't talk to enough law enforcement officers, in my opinion, to. Pete, you've been on both sides of it. You've been behind the badge. You've been out examining from the outside, and probably have some of the best ideas. We will link to all the documents in the show notes that we've been discussing, including the one that Tim signed. I want to thank you again for coming. And for anybody who didn't see your first interview, just remind us once again, if they want to find out more, where can they find what you're up to?
You can find me at LT Tim McMillan. McMillan, McMillan.com. That's my website. That'll link to right now, right, for Popular Mechanics and Vice. And so that'll link to all my other articles. Spoiler alert, they're not on law enforcement stuff. So that's, I did that, walked away from that, and now kind of find my time doing other things. And I'll say one last thing for 2 minutes, 30 seconds, and just say, as being an officer who's, while still active duty, stepped out and said, these are the areas that we can improve upon. These are things we need to do better. And facing backlash within, not my own department, but other police officers, agencies, all sorts of stuff, and everything. It's something that's not easy. And frankly, when I left and have up to this point for those 2 years, I kind of walked away completely. And so I just want to make sure anybody who's listening out there, if you know some good officers who are going above and beyond in the community, make sure you support those guys and girls, because they may have a tough road. And for me, when I left, it's kind of bittersweet. Well, I don't know. There's no sweet part yet, but it's that's why this whole event's. You're one of the few people, Jazz, I'd agree to talk to, because I kind of walked away from this stuff because it's emotionally taxing, because you're dealing with people's lives here. And
sure. No, we appreciate you sharing your time.
Mm-hmm. No problem, man. It's always a pleasure.
All right. One of these days I'll have you back again. We won't do such depressing stuff. We'll talk about UFOs or something.
Yeah, that'll be fun. Yeah, well, I'm thinking something else exciting. But no, I'm glad. Anybody, my email is on my website and everything. Anybody wants to reach out, discuss either these recommendations or just chat. I'm one of those people, man. I am a people person at heart, so I always enjoy talking to people.
Follow him on Twitter. He's very interactive. He's on there all the time. I should know because I'm on there all the time. All right. Lieutenant Tim McMillan, thank you again for your generous donation of your time to us, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Good talking to you, Jazz.
Adios.